literally a floating island of garbage in the middle of the ocean right now. Yeah, I think it's called Puerto Rico.
Racism has long been a deeply rooted issue in the United States, shaping its history and continuing to impact the lives of millions of people to this day. From the dark era of slavery to the enforcement of segregation laws, and now to modern-day discrimination across various sectors. A 2019 Federal Reserve report starkly highlights the disparity. The median wealth of white families in the U.S. stood at $188,200, while for black families, it was only $24,100, and for Hispanic families, $36,100. Adding to this, African Americans face incarceration at a rate 5.9 times higher than their white counterparts. According to data from the NAACP, although African Americans make up 13% of the U.S. population, they represent a staggering 40% of the incarcerated population. In 2020 alone, black men were nearly 3 times more likely to be killed by police than white men. The tragic memory of George Floyd's death in 2020 and the Black Lives Matter movement it ignited still resonates strongly. Yet, despite the national reckoning that followed, similar events persist. Take, for example, the heartbreaking case of Devontae Mitchell, who lost his life on June 30th. Mitchell's death involved 4 hotel workers in Milwaukee, 2 security guards, a front desk worker, and a server, who allegedly played a role in the incident. It began when Mitchell was dragged out of the Hyatt Hotel after entering the women's restroom. The workers restrained him face down for 8 or 9 minutes. During this time, Mitchell struggled to breathe, pleading for help, but his cries went unheeded. Before this, he had also endured physical violence. The autopsy revealed that Mitchell had ingested cocaine and methamphetamine and was morbidly obese, but the medical examiner concluded that his death was due to asphyxiation while being restrained. Looking back, racism in the U.S. has roots stretching back to the colonial era, when the transatlantic slave trade brought millions of enslaved Africans to America. Even after the Civil War and the abolition of slavery in 1865, African Americans continued to face institutionalized racism, particularly through the enforcement of Jim Crow laws. In modern times, racism endures in subtler yet no less damaging forms, often referred to as systemic racism. People of color, especially Black and Latino individuals, are frequently subjected to suspicion or differential treatment by law enforcement simply because of their skin color. But it doesn't stop there. Everyday Black Americans often face discrimination from fellow citizens, making racism not just a relic of the past, but a pervasive issue in the present. One city that embodies the challenges of racism is Chicago. According to a 2022 report by the Chicago Police Department, about 63% of all violent crimes in the city occurred in areas with significant Black populations. This alarming statistic is reflective of deeper systemic issues, many of which tie back to long-standing racial and economic inequalities. Data from the U.S. Census Bureau in 2021 shows that the poverty rate among Black communities in Chicago reached 25%, compared to just 9% in white communities. This disparity in economic opportunity is mirrored in the city's education system. Chicago Public Schools reported that schools in wealthier areas have significantly more funding per student than schools in low-income neighborhoods, exacerbating the divide in educational resources and outcomes. Housing segregation in Chicago is a stark reality as well. A report by the Metropolitan Planning Council revealed that 74% of Black residents live in neighborhoods that are predominantly Black. This is a direct legacy of the redlining policies implemented in the 1930s. which continue to limit access to safe and affordable housing for many Black families. In 2020, the Chicago Police Department also reported that 74% of all traffic stops involved Black drivers, even though they make up only about 30% of the city's population. Factors contributing to the persistence of racism in Chicago include entrenched poverty, limited access to quality education, and inequitable public policies. In Boston, Massachusetts, hate crimes disproportionately affect Black and Latino communities. A report from the Boston Police Department revealed that 63% of individuals stopped by police were Black, despite Black residents accounting for only 24% of the city's population. This disparity highlights a troubling pattern of racial profiling and over-policing in communities of color. As a result, these marginalized communities experience higher rates of violence, social injustice, and mental health challenges. Research from the Massachusetts Department of Public Health has shown that individuals living in neighborhoods with high levels of violence are at a greater risk for mental health issues such as depression and anxiety. In response, the City of Boston has launched initiatives aimed at improving access to education and job training for marginalized communities. Organizations like the Boston Foundation are working to promote equity in education and housing, striving to level the playing field for underserved residents. Additionally, community policing programs have been introduced to foster better relationships between law enforcement and the public, with the goal of reducing tensions and building trust between officers and residents. Los Angeles has a long and troubled history when it comes to race-based violence, often manifesting in riots and conflicts between ethnic groups. One of the most infamous events in the city's racial history was the Rodney King riots in 1992, which ignited deep tensions between the Black community and law enforcement, tensions that have continued to echo in the decades since. A report from UCLA reveals that Black student enrollment across the Los Angeles area has dropped by 42% over the last 2 decades. This decline is largely due to families struggling to keep up with rising rent prices, forcing many to relocate to more affordable areas. Some have moved to nearby regions like Antelope Valley, where housing costs are significantly lower. According to the California Department of Fair Employment and Housing, many neighborhoods in Los Angeles remain racially segregated. Past policies such as redlining have contributed to this segregation, as banks and financial institutions historically denied loans to Black and Latino residents, restricting their ability to buy homes in certain areas. Research by the Southern California Association of Governments shows that poverty and social injustice remain entrenched, fostering an environment where racial stereotypes and prejudices continue to thrive. In response, Los Angeles has launched various efforts to combat these issues. Initiatives like LA's Race and Equity Initiative aim to reduce inequality and implement fairer policies. Organizations such as the California Endowment and the Urban League of Metropolitan St. Louis are also working to promote equity in education and housing, striving to make meaningful progress toward racial justice. In recent years, New York City has also seen a surge in race-based violence. It's not just the Black community that has been targeted. According to a study by the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism at Cal State University San Bernardino, hate crimes against the Asian community skyrocketed by 223% in early 2021, marking a disturbing rise in xenophobia. A 2023 report from the New York Times, using data from the Center for New York City Affairs at the New School, highlighted the disparity in unemployment rates between racial groups. In the first quarter of the year, the unemployment rate for Black residents in New York City rose to 12.2%, while the rate for white residents dropped to just 1.3%, underscoring the deep economic inequalities that persist in the city. Despite these challenges, New York City has made significant efforts to address racial inequities. The Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice has developed programs to promote social justice and reduce inequality. Meanwhile, organizations like the New York Urban League are working to advance equity in education and housing. Community policing initiatives have also been introduced to build stronger relationships between law enforcement and local communities, aiming to foster trust and collaboration in the fight against systemic racism. Albuquerque has long struggled with racial disparities and violence, particularly among its Black and Latino communities. Data from the Albuquerque Police Department reveals that incidents of violence, including homicides, are disproportionately higher in these communities. Between 2013 and 2021, Black residents were 3.5 times more likely to be killed by police compared to white residents in Albuquerque. The economic divide in the city is stark. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, nearly 30% of Black and Latino communities in Albuquerque live in poverty, while the poverty rate for white residents is just about 10%. The New Mexico Public Education Department reports that around 70% of Black and Latino students in Albuquerque fail to graduate from high school, highlighting significant educational inequities. Negative stereotypes about communities of color often influence law enforcement practices in Albuquerque, and the root causes of racism here include economic injustice, a lack of education on racial issues, and the cultural and historical influences of the region. In response, programs like Albuquerque's Community Policing Initiative aim to foster better relationships between law enforcement and the communities they serve. Meanwhile, organizations such as the New Mexico Immigrant Law Center and the New Mexico Center on Law and Poverty are working to support racial equality in education and housing while raising awareness about human rights. Trenton, New Jersey faces substantial challenges with race-related violence. According to the Trenton Police Department, the city's violent crime rate is higher than the state average, and in 2020, 70% of all homicides involved Black individuals, a disproportionately high figure. New Jersey ranks 6th in the nation for school segregation among Black students and 7th for Hispanic students, as noted by previous national studies. A recent report from the Joseph C. Cornwall Center for Metropolitan Studies at Rutgers Newark found that statewide segregation often clusters underserved students together, leading to schools with limited resources and fewer opportunities, especially in preparing students for careers in fields like STEM. Research by New Jersey Health Initiatives also highlights the toll that living in high-violence areas takes on mental health, with residents more likely to experience depression and anxiety. Trenton has introduced several initiatives to tackle these issues. The city's crime reduction plan seeks to curb violence and improve community police relations, while organizations like the Trenton Health Team work to enhance access to healthcare and education for all residents. In New Orleans, racial disparities in poverty are particularly stark. Recent data shows that approximately 31.5% of Black or African American residents live in poverty, compared to just 4.9% of white residents in the New Orleans metropolitan area. These figures reflect deep-rooted economic inequalities that have been compounded by housing disparities, with the homeownership rate for Black residents at 43.0%, significantly lower than the 54.3% homeownership rate for white residents. Concentrated poverty in predominantly Black neighborhoods contributes to a range of social issues, including health inequities and limited access to quality education, Moreover, according to the New Orleans Police Department, gun violence disproportionately impacts Black communities, where the homicide rate is markedly higher than in white communities. In response to these challenges, New Orleans has launched several efforts aimed at reducing racial disparities. One key initiative is NOLA for Life, started by former Mayor Mitch Landrieu, which focuses on reducing gun violence and providing support to marginalized communities. The program aims to address both the immediate effects of violence and the systemic issues that perpetuate inequality, such as limited economic opportunities and insufficient community resources. Though Bellingham is smaller than many major U.S. cities, it still grapples with subtle forms of housing segregation. The Washington State Human Rights Commission has received reports of housing discrimination, particularly affecting the Latino and Native American communities. While the city does not experience extreme levels of violence like larger metropolitan areas, 2020 saw a rise in hate crimes reported by communities of color, especially in more isolated neighborhoods, coinciding with heightened racial tensions across the nation. The ACLU of Washington has highlighted that Black and Latino residents in Bellingham are more frequently subject to racial profiling and discrimination during encounters with law enforcement. The root causes of racism in the city are linked to a lack of diversity, limited education on racial issues, and the lingering impact of discriminatory practices throughout Washington State's history. To address these issues, Bellingham has launched several initiatives aimed at promoting equality. The Whatcom Human Rights Task Force works to combat racial discrimination and support marginalized communities. Additionally, the city has created programs like the Bellingham Racial Equity Commission, which advocates for policies that advance social justice and reduce economic disparities. Local schools and universities are also enhancing their curriculums to include education on racial issues and diversity, fostering greater understanding and awareness among younger generations. Milwaukee is one of the most violent cities in the United States, and racial violence is a significant concern. In 2021, the Milwaukee Police Department reported that over 70% of all homicides involved Black individuals. Both Black and Latino communities are frequently the victims of gun violence, and ongoing tensions between these communities and law enforcement often exacerbate the situation. Educational disparities are also stark. According to the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction, only about 60% of Black students in Milwaukee graduate from high school, compared to 85% of white students. Many Black and Latino residents are trapped in isolated, underserved neighborhoods, where limited access to resources perpetuates cycles of poverty and violence, as noted by a report from the American Civil Liberties Union of Wisconsin. Research from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee indicates that a lack of cultural understanding and historical context about communities of color often reinforces negative stereotypes and prejudices. In response, Milwaukee has launched several initiatives to confront these issues. Programs like Milwaukee's Blueprint for Peace aim to reduce violence and improve relationships between law enforcement and communities. Organizations such as United Way of Greater Milwaukee and Waukesha County are also working to increase access to education and social services, providing critical support to residents across the city. Coeur d'Alene, though a smaller and relatively peaceful city, has not been immune to racial violence and extremism. In recent years, the city has seen a rise in extremist groups and hate-fueled actions. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, Coeur d'Alene is home to several active hate groups, including white supremacist organizations, that have contributed to the city's unsettling association with far-right extremism. Economically, Coeur d'Alene faces its own set of challenges. the U.S. Census Bureau reports that the median household income is around $55,000, but minority communities often struggle more with employment opportunities and income inequality. The city's housing crisis adds another layer of complexity. While not as overt as in larger urban centers, reports indicate that minority communities frequently find themselves marginalized when it comes to accessing adequate housing. Although racial profiling and prejudice in law enforcement do not receive the same attention here as in larger cities, the problem exists. ACLU Idaho has documented that Black and Latino residents are more likely to experience racial profiling during interactions with police. These incidents, though less publicized, reveal underlying issues that Coeur d'Alene is working to confront. Local authorities have begun taking steps to address these challenges. Programs like community outreach programs aim to foster greater cultural understanding and reduce prejudice across the city. In addition, organizations such as the Idaho Human Rights Education Center are focused on educating the public about human rights and promoting equality. In contrast, Oakland has made significant strides in addressing racial disparities, particularly in education. By focusing on data-driven decision-making, Oakland has successfully reduced gaps in school discipline and increased graduation rates for students of color. The city's Department of Race and Equity, established to implement racial equity policies across city departments, emphasizes training city staff to recognize and dismantle institutional racism. The department promotes policies that drive social justice for communities of color, aiming to create a fairer and more inclusive environment. Louisville has also taken bold steps to confront systemic racism through its Lean Into Louisville initiative, which promotes dialogue around race, racism, and the impacts of racial disparities in areas like housing, education, and law enforcement. Following the tragic death of Breonna Taylor, the city introduced sweeping police reforms, including restrictions on no-knock warrants and changes in how officers engage with communities of color. These efforts reflect Louisville's commitment to tackling racial injustice head-on and ensuring that such tragedies lead to meaningful reform.